Second poetry reading this year. We had one with Matt and some of his folks in April. This is a new space that we've kind of refurnished and repurposed, and we're looking forward to more poetry readings, maybe some literary readings, who knows, other kinds of things that might be fun, so we're totally open to your ideas. Poetry in Motion is the title of today's event, and it is part of the Cuesta Faculty Lecture Series. We have 3 of our faculty members here who will be reading original poetry that they wrote and presenting that to you today. A couple more things I wanted to say, but I left them on that other piece of paper. If you have comments, you can, Gina had said, give your feedback directly to the instructors, the poets that will be reading. Right, and then we have their biographies, detailed biographies here on these beige sheets. If you need more of these, I've got a pile of them here. A couple other things we have going on today, and then I'm going to turn it over to Matt, who will be our first poet. We have, some of you might remember Kathy DeCou, who worked here for a long time. Her mother, Jane Elsden, was a poet laureate in San Luis Obispo County. She passed away last year, and as part of her poetry collection, she donated quite a few to the Cuesta Library. We've added a lot to our collection that is check-outable, but we have more. So we've got these here today for you. Take one. We just ask if you want to give us a little donation. That would be appreciated, but help yourself. They're from all manner of poems, poets. There's a couple in Spanish and so forth. So let me just read out the names of our speakers today, our poets. We're going to have Matt Fleming as our first poet, and he's from the English department here. Then we have Emily Shipley, also from the English department. She's sitting on the hot seat over here. And finally, Dr. Anthony Koeninger from history. Dr. K, he told me. And hopefully they'll all be very instructive, creative, and relaxing too. Okay, thank you.
Anybody need any more of the Poetry in Motion bios? They're right here. So actually we're going to go with Anthony first and then Emily, and then I'm going to go after this, but I wanted to start off this little reading with a little trivia game to auction off some of our old TELUS creative writing contest winner books. So there's selections here of student poetry, short stories, and essay in most cases. And so I've got 5 of them. So through the reading, I will do a couple of these and then have a reading and then some more. So this is really the classic poetry identification time. So if you know this poet, or these lines, I should say, mention who the poet is or what the name of the poem is, and you win one of the poetry books, all right? And I tried to mix these up a little so they're not necessarily all literary poets, all right? So the first one is, though, however, and the lines from this poem are a classic ending to a very famous poem, a paradox. And it says, "Thus, though we cannot make our sun stand still, yet we will make him run." Is anyone in here who doesn't teach English? Maybe? Yeah. Anybody know where that's from? Had we but whirled enough in time, this coyness would be no crime. We would pass our long love's day. And basically, right, he's saying, thus, though we cannot make our sun stand still, yet we will make it run. It's that seize the day thing, right? Time flies when you're having fun, which is the opposite of a poetry reading? I don't know. Our poetry reading is going to be short. They're going to be about 15 minutes each so that we can enjoy the words and their depth without getting too exhausted. But nobody knows, it's close. Andrew Marvell to his coy mistress. Do I give that to the guy, the teacher who raised his hand? Or you can give it to one of your students then? All right, we'll do one more and then we'll get on to Anthony's work here. Listen closely. These are sage, poetic words. But I got smarter. I got harder in the nick of time. Honey, I rose up from the dead. I do it all the time. I've got a list of names, and yours is in red underline.
I think I did.
I check it once, then I check it twice.
Taylor Swift.
Oh, what did you make me do? Exactly.
I'm sorry, who was it?
Taylor Swift's new song. Poetry's all about how you read it, right?
That's funny.
All right, so Anthony, if you're ready, we'd love to hear some of your poetry.
Thank you. I haven't read poetry in a long time. I've only read my poetry publicly twice before today, once in 1989 and once in 1999. So this is kind of new territory for me. Do you mind if I introduce my first poem with a little bit of history? And then the other poems, I don't need to have any history, any context. Well, a Marxist revolutionary named Plutarco Calles was president of Mexico from 1924 to 1928. And for years, Presidente Calles had harbored an intense contempt, a loathing for the Catholic Church. Well, during the summer of 1926, the so-called Calles laws were enacted in Mexico. Catholic schools were closed, monasteries and convents were shuttered, foreign priests and nuns were deported from Mexico. All sorts of public religious processions were absolutely banned. Priests and bishops who criticized the Calles administration received prison sentences up to 5 years. I mean, these Calles laws were unabashed, direct, frontal assaults on religious liberty. So the first poem was about a woman who fled the violence in Mexico, the religious instability in Mexico, and fled to Los Angeles in order to worship her devout Catholic faith freely. The poem is called The Rub. Lincoln Heights, East Los Angeles, California, October 4th, 1924. No, Senora Celaya, this is not Mexico. You cannot live with your goat and chickens in the apartment. This is Lincoln Heights. This is Los Angeles. Farm animals aren't allowed here. No, Senora, Presidente Calles cannot find you here. Calles cannot hurt you now. Senora, you may freely burn your candles and incense. You are free to worship Christ the King. This is America, the land of the free. No, Senora Celaya, that doesn't mean you can bring your chickens and goat in your apartment. This next poem takes place in LA in 1927. It's called Los Lavaplatos. It's about dish workers, immigrants who came from Mexico to LA in hopes of a golden future. These workers, without names, without papers, scour the flatware for hours, for days without end, in the humid heat in the kitchens. They come and go 6 days a week. They are invisible. They have no histories. No one knows what they dream. All day they pick and clean whole harvests of forks and spoons. Bowls and cups swim in seas of soapy water. The dishwashers themselves swirl in soap and water. Their lives whirl down into the drains. The next poem takes place in California sometime during the Great Depression. For some reason I have 1932, 1933 in my mind. A Democracy of Ghosts. Before the covenant rusted to metal scrap, the United States was gilded with the dawn, glutted with sunrise. But all the promise now becomes a spent sun. In the Coachella and Imperial Valleys, the children eat dirt at the end of the rainbow. Only with sun-bleached pigments can you paint a dream consuming itself, like a snake gripping its tail in its mouth. Consuelo holds Maria in her arms as the sun rakes Calexico. Consuelo keeps a poem under her breath, even though the dust turns Calexico to desolation. A long road, a skyway of dusty Sundays, caked mud, $15, no home. So the United States leaves promise burning like gasoline barrels in the heart. Nuestra Senora Guadalupe kisses the migrants who cup in their hands only the dark dancing of clouds. The faces of the poor swim through paradise. Wilted hearts dropped along the border. A hard road, Canaan in sight. Mexicanos dream an oasis in California. Some swear they've seen it. Some are trigger happy to touch it. Most lose heart, a world slipping through their fingers. From Brawley South to East Centro, to East Mesa, souls are smeared along the horizon like sunsets. A democracy of ghosts, in eternity devoured by wolves. Some of these are kind of somber, but this is El Dia de los Muertos, the Day of the Dead, but it's also a day of celebration too, as we remember the ancestors who have gone before us. The last days of Senora Celaya, November 4th, 1960. So this is the lady in the first poem who came from Mexico, and these are her last hours. The stars flicker like ghost eyes as Senora Celaya strings emeralds and colored lights in her kitchenette to ward off evil spirits. All night long she searches the occult to prophesy the next days, reading the stars to divine the fates. In the morning, Senora Celaya studies the sun through a prism of shadows. She blows omens out her living room window. Now in her last days, the little bird of a woman cranes her head from her front door. She calls out to Jesus, her king. Senora Celaya peers out among the fat, tail-finned automobiles and hoarsely honking trucks and buses, searching desperately for her savior in the soot and smog. She is sadly surprised not to find him resplendent in her front yard among the clumps of crabgrass, weeds, and smart aleck crows. Why is La Senora so heartsick? Why does she shut her door with such a heavy heart? North Hollywood, 1971. I was 11 years old living in North Hollywood. NoHo. And this is about a man I knew who was an artist, and he lived by himself. He had a lot of cats, and he was always working with all this bric-a-brac and creating this art. And this is about, the poem speaks for itself, I think. North Hollywood, 1971. With burnt orange and ashen dahlia, the quiet Mexican, native of Oaxaca, paints his last dreams, swirling across the shortening nights. Those final, sundry visions churn furiously like birds blown across the heavens in a swirling storm. For years, the artist has rubbed rain and smeared moon across his consecrated canvases. He has toiled unnoticed and unattended like a monk within the splendid isolation of his walled sanctuary. What exquisite art has blossomed unseen among his multi-debris. The splendor of his bespangled, ramshackled metallic poetry glimmers like a seascape in the eyes of his beloved cats. Now he stands a last time, forlorn, among the bits and pieces, the bric-a-brac, the relics, the fragments of his life. Tonight, the old man fades forever from the world, casting his sacred heart among the frozen clocks, broken bottles, snarred copper wire, and crumpled metal. His orphan cats bow their heads in sorrow. A Mexican woman, North Hollywood, California, Christmas Eve, 1971. A Mexican woman leaves Archie's Ranch Market walking up Lancashire Boulevard. She hugs her bag of fruits and vegetables to her chest like a treasure. This lady ignores the stores full of television sets and jewelry. Something else glimmers in her eyes. Who is this woman with the brown face and head crowned in a bouquet of bundled hair? Perhaps she is still unseen. Maybe she's Nuestra Senora Guadalupe, come into our age to save us from so many devils who shamelessly wheel around us each day. And just two more little poems. Do you mind two more little poems?
Go ahead.
Okay. This is about a boy I knew from East Los Angeles, Chepe Machado, who was 19 years old when he was shot and killed in East LA. I can't believe it's been so long, 2001. How many times did gorgeous angels dance in Gabriel Machado's eyes? How many hearts fluttered at his smile? Gabriel breathed beauty, brought heaven to East LA, so that cholos and chicas alike thought that he had banished dark clouds forever from the skies of the barrio. But clear skies only color illusions in dreamy blue, while the drug merchants of death dance brazenly through the neighborhood, their fiefdom. The spasms of gunfire reverberate in the ear endlessly. Gabriel Machado's blood leapt free from the wounds, the stigmata shimmering in the sundown light, his eyes still, lifeless, exquisite, like stained glass. On the feast of the resurrection, his body is offered back to the earth. In the next day's sunrise, San Gabriel, newly risen, dances among the cumulus. And the last poem is El Dia de los Muertos, the Day of the Dead. Los Angeles, November 2nd, 2001.
Today.
Today? All these years ago. The birds, frozen in murals, chirp to the epiphanies rising like great helium balloons over the earth. The moon dances ecstatically over the cemeteries. There is no grieving among these crosses and headstones. No lamentation, only celebration. The spirits thrive among these resting places. Skeletons strum guitars and hum ancient corridos that tell histories of love and war, hope and heartbreak. Here, Mexico is no mere memory. Here, the dead are not dead. Tonight, during this sacred reconciliation of souls, our ancestral ghosts thrive on chiclets, corn cobs, and Coca-Colas. Here in this ethereal kingdom, Quetzalcoatl and Nuestra Senora bless us with a sweet solace that knows no end. Thank you, you guys. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you. That was incredible and timely.
Thank you.
Very timely. So I've got a couple more little quotes for you guys to try out to win a free poetry book. So here's one that many of you should recognize. And it fits what I'm going to describe so well. Does my sexiness upset you? Does it come as a surprise that I dance like I've got diamonds at the meeting of my thighs? Ooh. Anybody? I could give another part of it away. Like a helium balloon, I rise. Anybody? Oh, that one. They've got it. Still I Rise by Maya Angelou. Ready?
Nice.
All right, and one more in his honor. You think you're going to take her away with your money and your cocaine? Keep thinking that her mind is going to change, but I know everything is okay. Because you got to listen to your heart, right? In memory of Tom Petty.
Yeah.
Great writers. All right, next up, Emily Shipley, and from her own mouth. And from her own mouth saying this is the first reading for fellow colleagues and all that?
A first reading of all these poems.
Oh my gosh. Okay, here we are. We're the test monkeys.
You
Okay.
are. You are my test subjects for these. So, I prepared 3 poems today to share with you all. 2 of them are about teaching because I figured with a faculty lecture series I should talk poetically about my profession. And the final poem is more about me getting old. So we'll go with teaching first. The first is kind of a funny poem, I hope. I hope I don't make people mad with it, but I think it's funny, and I hope you do too. It is called Assessment and No Chill. I need to have this on in the background, I say to the arched eyebrow across the room. Ina Garten's voice soothes me through grading midterms this week. Let's work on integrating quotes, shall we? I write in the margins. They truly improve an argument. How easy was that? I love the Food Network, by the way. I save Gordon Ramsay for final research papers. You call this a thesis? More like thesis is not the way you use a semicolon for the 10th time this semester. The jagged edges of paper corners loom mountainous beside the couch. Bollocks, glares Gordon Ramsay. Utter bollocks. Okay, so that's my funny poem. Use semicolons correctly, please. Okay. This next poem I wrote after an interesting encounter that I had with a Cal Poly student. I have taught, as you can see in your programs here at Cuesta, I've taught down at Hancock, and I have taught also at Cal Poly. So I feel like I have a wide range of experience with different populations of students. And one of my favorite demographics of students is the recent high school graduate, 18-year-old named Chad. And so what I've done is I've recounted a conversation with Chad for you in this poem today. And it is titled, Exploring Significant Moments, Your First Paper in Freshman Composition. I don't really have a significant moment to explore about reading or writing. He shrugged at me as the rest of the class hurried out the door. You don't remember anything? I asked, trying to slow down and make eye contact with this freshly minted freshman. I mean, yeah, I guess I read like Goodnight Moon and Dr. Seuss and shit. And what do you remember about that experience? I asked him. I feel like a therapist asking Chad to make meaning from a moment that has long been eclipsed by an Xbox and keg parties. I don't know. Well, try to get a brainstorm down this weekend at least. It doesn't have to be long, it just has to mean something. Jot down thoughts about your childhood and pinpoint the moments that changed you in some way that you know means something important for your life. I stopped walking and I turned to him, suddenly worried about the answer to the question I am about to ask. Do you know what your life means? He shifts uncomfortably. I smile nervously, raise my eyebrows, and wait. He says nothing, and I look at the overgrown boy fidgeting with his smudgy phone, and I realize I have seen him before, hundreds of iterations of Chad, combing the aisles of Target the second week of every September. They walk hungrily with their newfound roommates in packs, prowling the store like wolves looking for pillows and plastic storage bins and new headphones and beautiful girls, while their exhausted parents trail behind them, calling out questions about shower caddies and virginity. Dude, I'm not gonna text her back. I'll just see her tonight at Kappa Kappa Kappa. The Chads guffaw and punch each other's exposed shoulders in bro tanks. Some of the tanks have one tiny pocket over the right or left pectoral, and I wonder what purpose it serves and what significant moments might reside in that small space. Real. No, I'm not done. What story can you fit in a 2 by 2 inch square of cloth? The bro tank pocket is the fortune cookie of clothing, I conclude. I want to tell Chad to search in his pocket for a scrap of a memory that he can pull out and develop into a 2-page personal narrative, MLA formatted. I want to tell Chad he should reread Goodnight Moon and call his parents tonight instead of go to a frat party, because youth is exhilarating and fleeting, but childhood is eternal, even if we remember none of it. Instead, I fill the space with a bland suggestion. I guess you have some thinking to do this weekend, I say. Yeah, I guess I do, he replies. That's all right, so those are my teaching poems. This poem is written about one of my favorite places in the world, and that is London, England. Unfortunately, there are a lot, I guess fortunately or unfortunately, depending how you look at it, there are a lot of other poems written about London. A lot of very famous poets have memorialized this city. So I am at a loss for a good title, and I'm just calling it Another Poem About London. While I was there several years ago, this poem kind of recounts what that was like. And while I was there, I had the opportunity to discover one of these really interesting places in a big city, and that is called St. Dunstans. And St. Dunstans is a former church that is very old, that has survived years and years and years of chaos and turmoil in London, until finally the Blitz knocked everything out of it except for its walls and its spire. It was the only thing standing of this church, so it's a hollow shell that has been turned into a public garden for Londoners' use. And it's this really interesting little garden oasis in the middle of an otherwise kind of grimy part of town. It's by the Tower of London. And so this poem recounts what St. Dunstans is like, and you know, the Elgin marbles, which are housed at the British Library, which are these amazing sculptures that John Keats wrote about. And this is my attempt to try to place myself within London at this particular time in my life. So with that, another poem about London. It is 2004, and I am on a train streaking past red brick and graffiti and gray skies. Pasture to my right, to my left, the butt ends of windows and wash lines and antennae rigged up to former tenements, somehow dignified into modernity with the retained formal names of Victorian grandeur, alerting passengers of what once was. Salfords, Colston, Thornton Heath, roll by with the rhythmic rocking on tracks like an orchestra warming timpani to strings and horns, until the River Thames delivers us into Wandsworth, the final handoff to the Queen's Station, alive in the heart of central London. I call my mother in California from a payphone to tell her that I have landed safe and I'll see her in a few months. It is 4 a.m. where she is and 4 a.m. for me too, but the heady delight of poetry courses travels along the cables of my nerves, ready to charter the streets of Blake's London and the unreal city of Eliot. Amy Lowell's cold, glittering squalor awaits. Poetry is my prelude to endless evening walks and memorizing the routes of the tube system in 1 week, so I never look as lost as my mother thinks I am. In a cardigan sweater and under an umbrella, I find a church built in 1100, repaired over centuries after fires and floods on the banks of the Thames. Roofs caved in, spires too heavy, stones too rough, until Christopher Wren, for a time, saved the day, and then the 1941 Blitz left Wren's steeple and 4 shaky walls behind, amidst rubble and stiff upper lips and Londoners keeping calm and carrying on before it was a cliche. St. Dunstans was a hollow shell, but soon the vines and grass poked through the debris and climbed in tendrils, delicately intertwining with the flourishes of the Gothic arches, left with no glass in their panes, a garden rather to take its place. Here, I know something of empty shells that stay standing and how to resist entropy, too. Here, the world is quiet and different, and I am perceptive enough to understand what this means. And I am lying, of course. In 2004, I am 18 years old, and entropy is a dirty word, and I don't know what anything means, least of all aging and decay. But in 2017, I am 32 years old, and now I know entropy like step relatives who marry into the family. You accept them as a fact of life, but not a fact of your life. And now I claw through my memories of a summer in London to teach myself a lesson I learned at 18 all over again, which I thought was only the ineffable magic of a city and a first time away from home. Memory is the great teacher, and music too, so Joni Mitchell's Both Sides are at St. Dunstan's with me. And Paul Simon's most beautiful love song for Kathy is my ode to a warm night and an unexpected kiss on the steps of All Saints with a man I will never see again. But having heard Kathy's song live in Hyde Park makes up for it, though. That summer, I consider the Elgin Marbles and understand what Keats said about dim conceived glories of the brain. They are housed in museums but come tumbling from the mouths of a former and aging member of the IRA on the London Tube who declares his love of the Virgin and the Holy Catholic Church to unsuspecting 18-year-olds that need a lesson in theology and professions of faith. I confess my own scant and unripe sins to this Belfast transplant, and he blesses me with the sign of a cross that I will not fully comprehend until I am back in California and married and in a career and unsuccessfully getting pregnant and trying to stay in the middle class and hating myself for it all and wondering when exactly I cross the threshold into adulthood. This is when I will think of the cross. 12 years later, Jesus, Mary, and Joseph, I will say to myself, will I ever go back? At 18, I had an answer to this question. Now I have an elegy about trains, churches, art, and crosses, strange tokens of youth that are the pains of old pleasures, turned old wounds that keep me up far too late with an eye on the map and an impulse toward flight.
Thank you very much, Emily. And here we go, the last quote for the last poetry book. This is our one from 2006. It's got some really good ones in it, so listen closely here. And as we wind on down the road, our shadows taller than our souls.
Come on, guys.
There walks a lady we all know,
Who shines white light
Come on.
to our soul?
who shines white light and wants us to show. Yes,
Led Zeppelin, Stairway to Heaven.
the cameraman, Moses Zeppelin. Okay, well, this is the last of it here, and so I will get started. I'm going to do a couple poems about two brothers. That's my grandfather and his brother, and both of them were raised up on the Eel River by a father who only had a high school education, only had an 8th grade education, and was quite a brilliant guy, but rolled the rails out to California and built a homestead. Actually, he built 3 cabins up near the Eel River outside of Santa Rosa, but like the fires up there recently, all 3 of them burned down. So one after the other, he would build them as they burned down, as they lived in them. But what's really interesting about these 2 men that I'm going to write about is how they grew up in this really off-the-grid backwoods place where my grandfather was given a bullet by his mom and said, "Go get breakfast." And when she heard the shot, she would throw the butter in the pan. And it usually was a squirrel, right? Or something pretty basic. And that was when my grandfather was 4 and his brother was 6. So, a different world than we now live in for the most part. But these 2 brothers took very different paths. They both went to Annapolis.
Wow.
But one wanted to go to Annapolis to become a rocket scientist, which he did. The other wanted to go to Annapolis just long enough so he could get his pension and go back up to the cabin and live the rest of his life as a hermit, growing weed, making beer, and illegally fishing for steelhead, netting them in the rivers. Again, this is a long time ago. So this first one is about the younger brother, my grandfather, the rocket scientist. And he was a guy who did a lot of things that you'll hear about in this poem. But one of the things he did that was most surprising to the family, besides shooting rockets and working and starting NASA and doing all this other stuff, was that in his later years, he upset the family by who he chose to marry. And so this is a poem that is his history, and then his almost undoing of his history by his action in the perspective of the family. It's called Fiery Cryogenesis. And I was always worried I was going to be around when my grandfather died, because he wanted us to cut his head off and keep it frozen till the cryogenics people could get there to fix it. And he sounds crazy, but he was terribly practical. He said, the problem is, it's hard to find a company that's going to be solvent for long enough to keep my head frozen until they can use me again. I'm like, you're right, that is a problem. Make sure I'm never around when you die. Fiery cryogenesis. From the back hills of Northern California, grandfather spent his young years netting steelhead upon the eel. His father had ridden the rails to the West Coast, only an 8th grade education rattling in his genius brain. He raised his son, Captain Robert Truex, on the way of Milky Row, and aimed for the stars, you might hit the moon. As a young man, Robert burned through Annapolis and on to the Second Great War, dissecting contrails of V-2 buzz bombs for a return flight to the fatherland, counting forward with Goddard, dining with Arthur Clarke and Wernher von Braun, Titan, Polaris, fired at dawn. He pushed gravity's envelopes with the liquid fuel finger of glamorous Glennis and pulled the heavens just a little bit closer with the founding of NASA and Vandenberg. Later, over deep canyons of Idaho, shooting steamed evil across the Snake as the 70s spun down. Who wants to be Spam in a can? You don't need the right stuff, just 10 grand. Grandfather launches his private project enterprise decades before Elon Musk became the rocket man of our future. His Saratoga backyard bristles with raised schools of metal fishes casting their swimming shadows over the Perry-built pool. But in 1996, we bystanders at Knievel criticized from seated booths, behind blast-proof glass, his career's twisting flight at 17,000 feet above our heads and above the sticky black tarmac. We vainly cry, "Mission Control, we must have a hold." But we are too late. Ground Control, we have liftoff. In the afterburn of a fiery cryogenesis, my 75-year-old grandfather weds a 20-year-old Colombian, and his fame upon reentry crashes and burns. His reputation's trajectory, his Rocket Man renown, all those Johnny Carson smiles counted up, now count down. But family and slandery are forgetting. At altitude, genius is its own alibi. So this next one's the other brother, my Uncle Dick. And he's up there on the side of a mountain, living like a hermit. And we showed up one night. Had to hike in for about 17 miles on the tracks, was the only way to get there at that time. And I called my dad and I said, "Dad, tell me that story about when we went up to Woodman, as we called it." And so I think he'd been drinking enough, and it was about 9 in the evening, and I put record on, and then he just started blabbering away. And then I formed that into something of a poem. And I think my point in this in my classes is that we all have these amazing stories of experiences to tell, whether they're our own or our families, and we all delight in hearing all these things. And we think that poetry is something different than that it's something stuffy and boring, and it doesn't have to be. It can be something that you just work on to get the right effect, but it's just telling a story. And so this is a conversational poem inspired by that story. It's called Midnight Rattling. So we get there banging, banging, banging on the door. It's 2 or 3 in the morning and we haven't been up his way in a few years. And finally Uncle Dick wakes up, puts on his old green rotting terry cloth robe, and he gets out there, and there are beer bottles all over the kitchen, and I brought some fresh beer, even though he's got all this homebrew in his quart, he's got some homebrew in quart green bottles underneath the house in all those cardboard boxes. And you could smell yeast in the air and old pieces of steelhead on the counter, and he gets up and he's fixing us something. He's got a deer he's killed. So anyway, there's this knock, and we're there, and it's dark, and there's this knock on the door, sort of a bang, 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 and I'm thinking, who the hell would be showing up here on the eel to see Dick at 11 p.m., near midnight? Well, Dick gets up, staggers, he's drunk, stoned, whatever. He goes to the door, opens the kitchen door of his old little kitchen on the cabin, which is perched on the edge of the mountain, and in walks this buck. And I remember, it was a 3-point buck, and it actually had to turn its head to get in through the door. And this is this nice big deer, and we're just sitting there. And the deer is there, and it sniffs. You know, we're cooking deer meat. And I don't think I knew what it was, but it looks around for a little bit, walks past the wood stove, turns its head again, and steps into the living room. So I get up and I'm following this deer, and it turned its head again and went into this little living room and starts walking across the floor. And on the floor, covering the whole living room, or the whole room, are hundreds of Playboy centerfolds. And they're not just thrown around either. They're carefully placed and laid out lovingly to cover every square inch of the floor. Anyways, so I'm up and I'm following this deer, and it turns its head again and walks into Dick's bedroom, and it gets on the end of the bed, and the deer lays down and goes to sleep. And that's a true story. So, a lot of storytellers, most families have them. My dad is a big one for that, telling other people's stories and lots of his own. And this is one he tells of being in school, a little different than we now have. It's called corporal punishment. and prayer in school. Miss Hughes was a good 6'1". She had a huge black purse, and she used to carry a length of black rubber hose, heavy black hose. And she'd come up behind you if you did something, and she'd just thump you. And people would scream in pain, and then she would walk up and down the rows. And this woman, who supposedly had lived somewhere near earlier in North Dakota and had written letters about fluoridation in the water because it was the communists poisoning our bodies. And every day she would come back from lunch with a different set of clothes on. Walter would sneeze. He would really sneeze. And he couldn't control it. So nobody would sit in front of him. I would always sit behind Walter. That was never a problem. He had a cold. And this new student was in class, and she sat in front of Walter. She didn't know. And every few minutes, he would start his tremors and grab into his pocket for a handkerchief to contain his nose. I can remember some of the most deeply religious moments of my life. When I really prayed, we're sitting back there. I can remember clasping my hands together, praying for him to sneeze, praying he wouldn't make it in time, praying he wouldn't make it to the handkerchief. And it happened. And it went all over her. And he started to wipe it up, and he touched her hair because you could see it in her hair. And she turned around and looked on his desk, and she started to cry. And Walter didn't care, and by this time he's cleaning off his book, and then somebody laughed. And Miss Hughes got up, and she popped those heavy snaps on her purse, and out comes the rubber hose. And she thumps Walter. And I'm afraid of Miss Hughes, and she's just screaming, and he's screaming. And when you can't laugh, it's the best. And I'm just sitting back there, and I'm holding my hands, and I'm holding my stomach, and I'm just rocking there, and somebody else starts to laugh, and somebody else starts screaming, and I'm just sitting back there, and she thumps a few more kids, and now everyone is screaming and starting to laugh, and Miss Hughes starts to cry, and then she runs out of the classroom. I heard from Walter a few years ago that she'd done her final change of clothes. And I'm just sitting here thinking of a rocking self-embrace in a mad corner of Vacaville. Okay, so change of pace here. Here is a poem about November, and it's about what happens in November on the Central Coast when the cold air from the inland areas, the Atascadero and Paso Robles, wants to rush out to the sea. And as it goes down the canyons, the molecules get closer and closer together and begin to create friction, and they heat the air up, and we call that, well, LA calls it the Santa Anas, we call it the Santa Lucias, right? Those offshore winds. So this song is called Offshore November, this poem. November mornings bring a cold, strong flow of wind and light to an ever-changing, constant sea. In the early sunlight, my sister and I wake to press our mark upon the day, to take in hand and heart these moments we recognize as truth, as life, as living. I could say it is like so many other fantastic dreams. December, sinking into pillow snow off summit's edge. June, swimming into everlasting ice cream making. July. September, walking to the smell of tar weed and gunfire. But I would only be making similes. November mornings reach through and across landscape and memory, drawing us in towards the deeply independent sea. An energy surfaces within us. From a subterranean feeling, it rises through our limbs and eyes, pushing us towards this meeting with motion. This ancient desire, the unknown idea of ocean, it drags us out past history towards Odysseus and Drake. Above the many lives given and taken by the eternal ebb and flow. November mornings regretfully kiss summer's silhouette and winter's shadow, stolen in the middle of everything, the transparent sea. From a hilltop overreaching the sea, we watch the surf transform before us, fading almost gone the lapping days of August that gently wash the shore with whispered waves, and approaching December cast a just perceptible shiver over the day's dawning. But here in the energy moment, everything calm and tangled suspends for just 1 month. In this seasonal hour, the breakers take long and even breaths, and the warm wind of summer runs out to sea. The deepening grooves fight the steady air, throw back their rain in water, shake and trail cold liquid mains behind them. And my sister and I stand on the shore of a fading continent, where flecks of surf and reflecting marine battle for the sky. Then the tilting rush draws us out and beyond the land's decay. Over heavy lines of protein trenches, we can escape the binding time, the vicious sculptor of moments, who chips the shards of days and calls them hours, grinds the fragments into minutes, puts forth his art after the ripping. Struggling against heavy light and polished water, we make strong, fluid movements that carry us up and over the cresting shine. For an instant, we float in a margin of silence between what is to come and what is broken before. And then like a monument, it rises before us, and I turn my back on it to face its glory. 1, 2, 3 unconscious strokes, and the glide begins beneath me. The dangerously feminine bend of a perfectly curving wave sends me up and down its serpentine length. I dance upon the rinsing air, the liquid mercury, the corrugated glass, the moving wilderness, the deep blue devil that saves my static soul from the too solid earth. And just if you don't know, poetry can pay. That helped buy me an electric guitar.
There you go.
All right, here's one about my 2 girls who couldn't be here today. I have Rio, who is 11, and Amalia, who is 15. And since they were young, of course, I've poured the poetry poison into their ears in every possible way.
They were here last time.
They were here last time, yes. And they will be performing at the Songwriters Awards tomorrow at New Times. If anyone's in, there'll be an event for the songwriters of the county, and at the Fremont they'll be presenting. And all I can say to that is it's not because their dad teaches poetry and plays music. It's because they were allowed to just be wrong and try things. And I, of course, think that that's what, as poets, we all know we have to be able to sound stupid and not always get it right, so that when we do, we feel like we've earned it. So this poem is about my 2 girls. It's called Love on the Edge of a River, and one of my daughter's names is Ria. We have moved through seasons, making love on the edge of a river blossom. On an island with lava and fire, we poured chocolate on our tongues. We have walked the ancient steps of others, letting temperatures rise in the smoke. And in the heart of a hidden country, we pulsed mint and rum. And out of sweetness, we created life that smiles back in the sunset. We wandered together, her small feet leading us to oceans, hands that held ours in circles, in pines, with friends. She made you more beautiful. Together, we learned to find the fruit lost in the rind. We peeled back the bitterness, revealed flesh and seed, fertile ground by the water. We grew another river, with more fires and sunsets, trees with blossoms falling on our faces in sunlight that cartwheel on the sand, flowing to the water where it begins. I will try one more here, I think, or 2 more. There is Death by Shark, which is always a fascinating topic for me. So here it is. This one's called Understanding Cousteau. 5 years ago, I had a dream of Eden. Sharks floating fin down in the moonlight, belly white, like Russian vacationers bathing in iced Baltic waters. These smiling barbarians with their terrorist teeth no longer playing Marco fucking Polo with me. You said, how can I hate something so natural? What's more natural than loathing something that wants to eat you? In his early years, Cousteau viewed these living dinosaurs as I do. But his story changed as he became one of them, swimming in the under, observing on the level the thin decadence of sand scratch, skin, and angled teeth. But the aquatic addiction pushes me out to meet the nightmare, slip into my impression of a seal, slide down the food chain with every wet step. And they're always out here, underneath me. These ancient and efficient beasts of my murky dreams. I float on this watery web of darkness, a shining daydream prey. Denial, the only protection against real and imagined things. But it is on those days when the ocean whispers its dark secrets, wakes and warns the prehistoric mind, that the terrifying creativity begins. Feel the tension, feel the surface tension, sense nothing and everything as something it is not. A pelican's bent wing, a smeared gray triangle in the fog. Did you see that? That hollow slap of alien flesh and water and the frantic recoil from the slightest bump of kelp or fish. Yet somehow I live for this thrill, for the predatory chill that the breath mornings wear, when the bite of air and water blends with the colder currents of fear rising from below. Give me the scare of the rip and tear, the horrific picture of a suit of armor swallowed whole, undiscriminating death without thought, without care, where instinct rises to taste everything that exists, a tiger, a sea lion, man. I no longer dream ignorant of paradise. I no longer desire the slow die of land, where death arrives as a heart attack or a car wreck on Sunday, not in some great battle of adrenaline near a kelp bed on a Pacific break under a sky that crystallizes before panic dies. And then my last poem here is a short one, and it is a poem that was written because I like to experiment with different ways of breaking writer's block. And I try to tell my students that as well, right? Just record yourself blabbering, whatever, to find different ways to create. And this poem was written in conjunction with another poet, where it was I write a line, she wrote a line, and back and forth. And the wonders of the internet at work. I've done it with music to collaborate with artists, but I've never done it with a poem. So keep in mind that half of these lines are mine. This is called Verbal Kama Sutra. Never fall in love with a poet. She will break your heart, then live to write about it. Although pure in her own mind, she will expose your passions to the elements in a cacophony of rhyme. I once told her, always give your sex to the poem, and the poem to your sex. Like a verbal Kama Sutra, position is everything. And she took my words as truth, revealing every last angle. Now I can't visit a coffee shop or bookstore for fear of being recognized for who I really am. Thank you for everybody that put it on, the library staff and everyone else who came, and I think, do you have any more comments?
I was just going to say, what a great way to spend an afternoon or an hour. We're so lucky to have these guys and females here to share their culture and creativity. And actually, each of the bouquets is for, I have a bouquet for each of you guys. So take that with you. That's Gina's thoughtfulness. And we did tape the session, so that'll be available in a week or so, Richie? Do you think? Okay.
Oh, I'll watch it over and over.
Yeah. And we hope to do this again. Thanks for coming.
Thank you, guys.